Paul, thank you for joining me. I've been familiar with your work in a number of spaces. I know that you've written for Where Peter Is. I'm familiar with the Third Space podcast, where you kind of explore difficult topics within the church and in the hopes of kind of coming to more nuanced, helpful approaches to a range of issues, especially focusing on things like spiritual abuse or harms experienced within the church. I know that you have a history as a catechist. I know that you work now as a mental health professional, and we're going to kind of dig into that story and how those pieces relate. But maybe before we get started, I'll just invite you to kind of introduce yourself. Who are you? What do you do now?
Chris, thanks so much. So I'm a limited license counselor in the state of Michigan. Before that, I worked for about 8 years at a local parish as a full-time catechist, director of religious ed. I got my undergrad in theology from Aquinas College in Grand Rapids, Michigan. That's also where I got my my master's in clinical mental health counseling as well. So that's like one avenue of professional work. I also lead online workshops and do some individual coaching around spiritual abuse in the Catholic Church, and then create resources, do speaking, consulting, things like that with different Catholic organizations around this topic as well. Also been married for like 14 years and have 5 kids, so life is always very busy. So that's who I am.
Yeah, I've been having a lot of conversations with parents, and I think I'm busy, but trying to schedule around parents is much more difficult than scheduling around my life, apparently. So I'm glad you could take the time to join today. I'm really interested in, it takes a certain type of Catholic to pursue a full-time career as a catechist. So maybe could you talk a little bit about what led you into that as a starting point for your career?
Yeah, I suspect that my story is in some ways not dissimilar from a lot of other, like, quote, professional Catholics of the millennial age. I was homeschooled growing up, a pretty conservative homeschool group. I watched the Amazon special about the Duggar family a couple of years ago, and I'm like, okay, that wasn't quite my experience, but I had like the LaCroix version of that. Like I had there were flavors of that in my experience. Went to youth group and stuff in high school. Went to Steubenville youth conferences throughout high school, and it was on one of those where I had a really, really transformative encounter with the Lord through adoration and the sacrament of confession. And yeah, that just put a desire in my heart to do ministry in the church in some way. That was also at the end of my senior year of high school. So I went on to study at Aquinas College, and I was going to study political science, and then shifted that major to theology to go into ministry. So, being in the, evangelical deconstruction space, Catholic deconstruction space, there's hints my story in a lot of other stories of people in my generation.
Yeah. And, going into your career as a catechist, what did you like about that work?
Oh, I love being a catechist. And I don't work formally as a catechist. I do incorporate catecheses into my workshops about spiritual abuse, because I think that both the church's anthropology, but then especially its social teaching, I think provide a really helpful framework for understanding spiritual abuse. But the work of a catechist. So I was just thrown into this job because I had a theology degree and was, willing to be paid way less than I, should have been paid at a college.
Or would have been paid doing literally anything else.
But okay, so the word catechist means to echo down. Like there's a sense of you're echoing down a message that isn't your own, but through you, like through my own talents, my own charisms, my own personality, my own experiences and story, sharing a message that isn't my own. And it just hit like my love of the intellectual. It hit my love of teaching, and especially doing RCIA, now OCIA, working with adults who are coming into the church, being able to engage with people both on a personal level and an intellectual level, and honestly, I just love, I love the church's teaching. I love the
Sure.
catechism of the church. I'm the person who is like, oh, there's a new apostolic exhortation coming out today. Great. I'm going to wake up extra early so that I have time to start it before I start work.
Hmm. Hmm.
It's just, yeah. Other
Like the
people
royal
like other
wedding.
things. It's just, some people like Star Wars, some people like football. I like encyclicals.
I like the catechism. Yeah. I mean, I totally get that. I can definitely relate to that. Being like a very like zealous Catholic heady child, I relate to a lot of your story of, I went to like a net retreat in high school and had like what I think was a religious encounter that I think gave me a lot of like passion and also just consolation, and definitely informed the way that I showed up in my like Catholic faith from then on. So I relate to a lot of what you're sharing, and also just the beauty of ministry. I still find myself really moved when I walk into Catholic churches and I just see random people praying, because I think that churches are one of the few places where you can walk in and there might be someone from any socioeconomic, racial, political, social background, and they're in there kneeling vulnerably, trying to connect with the divine, with parts of themselves where they may feel the greatest insecurity or pain or vulnerability. And it's really beautiful. Even I think about my last trip to Rome where I went to St. Peter's, and there's like a little box that a priest stands in, and there's a line of people where they can go and get a blessing, and it looks like you're like lining up to like go to the post office or something. And I don't even know if the guy was wearing a collar at the time. I was really confused what was happening at first, and I saw, I was like, oh, like the people are lining up to like get their like little booth blessing. Which on the one hand seems silly, but on the other hand, there's something really beautiful about people just going in for something that they want to connect with some of the deepest parts of themselves, and so I understand why ministry is beautiful and compelling for a lot of people.
And
You know?
and there's something I think, probably not unique to Catholicism, but very present in Catholicism is this like sacramental worldview that it's through the kneeling and the blessings and the lines and the boxes and the churches, through these really material, sometimes very mundane things, that we're invited to have these types of spiritual encounters. There's something I think really tremendous about that too.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of beauty, but also one of the things that we're going to get into is there's often also a dark side when these things meet up with or connect with institutional environments. So, I'd be really curious for you, when you were going into full-time ministry, catechetical work, what did you think it was going to be like? And then what did you actually encounter?
One of the first things that comes to mind with that question is, so after I graduated with a theology degree, at that point, my wife and I were just married. We were pregnant with our first. We had lots of college debt and really lucrative theology degrees. So I got a job. I had 3 part-time jobs. One of them was like a night shift at a library that I used to apply for other jobs. In any case, I worked at like a bookstore for 2 years, which was fantastic, but not ministry. But when I finally got a job in ministry a couple years after I graduated, 2 people from the college I went to, who were in the theology department in campus ministry there, were like, essentially they said, don't let the church take away your faith. And I was like, you're just, kind of jaded about this whole thing. I'm like, 24 years old. I have it all together. So what did I expect? I don't know. I was really naive. I had no idea what I expected, other than I loved the work and honestly felt like, and still do in some ways, though differently, I felt like it was a privilege to be able to do that work. Now, my naivete and my sense of this work being a privilege, I think, was taken advantage of in some ways. But so expectations wise, I was just profoundly grateful to be able to doing that work.
Yeah. So yeah. Okay. So your kind of naivete, your sense that this is a privilege. You said that you felt that was taken advantage of. Can you share some more about that?
Yeah, so the there's lots of layers, lots of aspects to this story. Um, One is post college, I really got into Catholic social teaching, which
Hmm.
in my theology degree um, was only barely touched on. That wasn't something that we went into in depth. And liking liking politics, I was like, I'm really interested in this. And then, I was hired at the parish, um, right at the beginning of the 2016 election cycle. So
Yeah.
um, I was raised
Mhm.
I was raised very pro-life. I was very much a part of the pro-life movement in college, and I'm watching Donald Trump run for president, and I'm like,
Mm.
this makes me really uncomfortable. People who I
Mm.
looked up to in a lot of ways, who I
Mhm.
used to look up to because of their values, their belief in human dignity, were lining
Mhm.
up behind someone who I saw as dramatically opposed to that. And I
Mhm.
saw so so I was like, the pro-life movement used to frame my political um it used to frame my political outlook, but then I was like, this is inadequate. I was looking for Catholic social teaching. That's where I ended up. And as a part of that, and then not only was I exposed to really wonderful teaching about politics and human dignity, I was also exposed to really wonderful teaching about, like the dignity of workers, and
Mhm.
very, very quickly realized um, the church, at least in the U.S., like just utterly fails at following
Mhm.
its own teaching, to the point where I reached out to a Catholic labor advocacy group, and I'm like, hey, is there such thing as a union for lay employees in the church? And he was like, no, there's not at all. I'm like, wait, what? He's like, not in the United
Mm.
States. He's like, because the Supreme Court
Oh.
gives all these allowances for religious liberty, the labor board isn't going to enforce it. He's like, now if a bishop
Cool.
wanted to have it, he could allow it, but he doesn't. So there aren't any, other than a couple of schools in the U.S.
Hmm.
So that was part of that first chink in, okay, I should have more expectations of this
Hmm.
institution that I'm working for. Um, and then so there were external things and internal things. Some of the external things was obviously Trump was elected president, and then the pandemic happened,
Mhm.
and I'm formed by these values, both first from the pro-life movement and then from the church's social teaching on the infinite dignity of every person and
Mhm.
prioritizing the vulnerable. And I'm looking at, the Pope Francis in Rome making all these statements about how we ought to behave and treat the vulnerable in the pandemic,
Mhm.
and watching local Catholic communities do the opposite.
Mhm.
Watching parishes in my diocese with pastors who felt like they could just do whatever they wanted, because in reality they could do whatever they wanted, and
Mhm.
made people unsafe, and in some cases threatened to fire employees who weren't comfortable going along with um,
Mhm.
their way of handling the pandemic, even though that went against. I mean, honestly, in my diocese, there was a pastor in my diocese who sued my state because we had a mask mandate at the time, and in the lawsuit it said that masks covered the image of God, and
Mm.
therefore
Yeah.
the school ought to have a religious exemption. I'm watching this, and I'm like,
Yeah. I
what
remember
the
that
hell are we
one.
doing here?
Yeah.
So there was some external stuff going on, but then more internal was the pastor I worked for the whole time I worked at this parish. Um, Looking back on it, I would say he had a lot of narcissistic behavior. Uh,
Hmm.
he was unwell in a lot of ways. In the first several years I was there, I covered for that a lot. Um, like, Father's not really great at that. He's good at these other things. Let's not bother
Uh,
Father with that.
yeah.
Those types of
Yeah.
things.
Yeah.
But then the
And,
last few
and could you give some example? You mentioned narcissistic behaviors. Like, how would that manifest itself?
So, in in one of my grad school classes, how narcissistic behavior was described was it's like this black hole of profound insecurity. So the person needs to like control and manipulate their environment and their relationships to feel secure. So there was a lot of that. There was a lot of pitting some groups of people against other groups of people. There was a lot of lying to protect a lot of insecurities. There was, you kind of don't know which person you're going to get on any given day. And if you're on his good side, you're great. But then as soon as you're not on his good side, then there can be a vendetta out against you. Right. And that behavior escalated over the years, and to the point where, to make a very long story short, to the point where a colleague was fired, and the pastor lied to the community and said that she had resigned. So the rest of the lay ministry staff, myself included, we all quit, and we're in constant communication with diocesan HR through all of this. And the next week after we all quit, the pastor publishes a bulletin article naming all of us and accusing all of us of grave sin.
I mean, I shouldn't laugh because I'm like, that's so wild. Oh gosh. Okay.
It's wild to tell. And the context is, this is a small town of like 1,000 people. That's like 90% Catholic. So the community and the parish are really one in a lot of ways. I moved to the community. I'm not local here, but the other staff members were. And it's like, it was his own undoing in a lot of ways.
Yeah. I mean, to me, that I read that immediately as, oh, this is clearly someone who is unwell. But also, when a pastor gets to a point where they do something like that, it's definitely not the first thing that they've done. And the diocese has definitely been made aware of other issues, right? And it's like, dioceses, they don't want to take action until someone's been seriously harmed or they've done something way out there that's totally unhinged.
Yeah.
Right. And so instead of preventing harm, they kind of toe the line until someone gets really harmed, and then they decide to take action, which is...
So there's that, but there's also added layers to it. So you're very right that us staff members were transparent with the diocese for years, and it wasn't just us. The diocese was very aware of what was going on here. So after he published his bulletin article, we go, the former staff, we're going to the diocese and we're like, what can you do about this? And the refrain that we heard over and over again was, he hasn't committed a crime, so there's nothing we can do. That's the standard. He hasn't committed a crime, so there's nothing we can do. Now, his health wasn't well, so a few months later, he needed some type of medical procedure. So he asked for medical leave, and he was given medical leave upon retiring. So maybe there was a backdoor thing where the bishop was like, we'll give you the leave if you retire because of all the problems. I don't know, because publicly he was given all the accolades a pastor receives after so many years of service. And the diocese refused to say that anything was a problem publicly. Yeah. Then we had an interim pastor, and then a year after that, a permanent pastor. And again, neither of them would come out and say, what he said was wrong. And the ways that he publicly abused his power were wrong. And as I've thought back, that was several years ago now, and thinking about like what felt like the worst betrayal, it wasn't from the pastor. Like, I had a real sense of like, he was unwell. This was him being in this position of authority was just as bad for him as it was for everybody else. But it was the system that allowed him to be there, the system that covered for him, and the system that refused to tell the truth after the fact. That I was, and it's not a disembodied system. It's a system of individuals who I had spent 8 years at that point building relationships with, and had their cell phone numbers, and would bring them food when they had babies, and would meet for coffee, and like real relationships with people. So there's I think that's definitely where I felt the most sense of betrayal. But it also, there was a shift in that experience of, at that point, that's when I started publicly, several months after that, started publicly talking about spiritual abuse and hearing more people's stories, and hearing also survivors of sexual abuse in the church, and being able to hear their stories in a way that I wasn't able to before, of, oh, when you talk about betrayal from the institution, I know what that means. When you talk about this being a systemic problem, I have a taste of what that means. So yeah, there was an opening up, I guess, of my conscience to some extent, to hearing things I wasn't able to hear before.
Yeah. A couple of things come to mind, very similar to what you said. In talking with mental health professionals who've worked with victims of clergy sexual abuse, one of the things that they've told me is often the most lasting trauma does not come from the original abuse. It comes from the rejection, the disbelief, the dismissal from family members, community members, and religious leaders. That actually a lot of times it has more lasting harm. The other thing that comes to mind for me as well is that, when you raise the issue with the pastor of these harms, obviously they have accountability for the harm and they're the one driving the harm. But then when you go to people in position of authority over them, who should be responsible for and accountable for a lot of this behavior, and you raise it and they don't do anything, then they actually also become parties to the harm. And I mean, U.S. employment law operates like this, right? If someone brings a complaint about someone in an organization and that organization does not address it, then the problem isn't just about the individual anymore. The organization is itself participating in the problem and is liable for it. But there just unfortunately is such a lack of accountability from leaders across the church, including, I honestly think, some of the best leaders when it comes to clergy sexual abuse. I had a conversation with a Catholic bishop who I do believe is actually one of the best in the U.S. in terms of addressing abuse. And we discussed a situation where a parish volunteer had sexually abused a child in the parish, and the pastor was made aware, and the pastor, it was years after the abuse had occurred, and the pastor didn't do anything in relation to the volunteer. And I sat across the table from the bishop, and the bishop told me, well, what am I supposed to do? Because I have to respect the rights of him and of the volunteer. And we don't know anything yet other than that this allegation's been brought forward and they're not an employee of the church. So, what's the pastor supposed to do in that situation? And I was just like, obviously the pastor's supposed to pull them as a volunteer while they explore this, which was not the position of the bishop, right? And when I think about this is the position of actually one of the best bishops, I think, in the church when it comes to this, this really has me concerned about the prevalence of abuse throughout the church generally.
And I've heard repeatedly from different people who work in this area of safeguarding, it's taken as a given that the U.S. church is by far the most equipped and the best prepared and has the best policies to handle abuse of any other country in the world. So, like, you're talking about the best of the best, Chris.
Yes.
And what also comes to mind hearing that is, I think of the final synod document that came out last year, 2024, where it called for transparency, accountability, and cooperative decision-making at every level of governance in the church. And I would add, too, in the church's teaching, and most explicitly from Pope Leo's exhortation a few weeks ago on the poor, to add a preferential option for the poor and the vulnerable in that. So many levels of governance just fail to meet that standard in so many ways, all the way up. I mean, even to the point of Rome, and looking at a case like the Father Rupnik case, the profound lack of transparency. Just the first one, transparency is lacking. So even the best, we see this, like you said, this failure to do even some of the most basic things.
Yeah. And I do wonder, and I hope that a big part of it comes from a generational divide. I do think that, millennials and Gen Z in general tend to be much more equipped to have conversations around, especially sexual harm, and the ways to address it. Whereas, I think about, I raised an issue with a major Catholic ministry about an issue where one of their leaders had was being accused of sexual violence against a woman, and the way in which the leader, who was a bishop, talked about it, they referred to the woman as an accuser. They said they opined openly with their staff about whether that person was coming forward because they had some kind of grudge. They named the individual to their entire staff. And when I think about a lot of these things and these issues, and I think about that bishop and a lot of bishops, I think a lot of this doesn't come down to malice. I don't think that bishop meant to cause any harm. I just think that a lot of these bishops are just utterly incompetent when it comes to talking about sexual violence, addressing sexual violence, being managers of employees and managing institutions. And also me now being a manager myself of a global team that has multiple layers. I know how easy it is to make mistakes as a manager. And fortunately, there are a lot of structures around me that encourage good behavior. And there are good reporting structures for my employees if I do something harmful. But we just don't have, in my opinion, that degree of competence among a lot of Catholic clergy generally, including many, maybe most of our bishops.
Yeah. Yeah. What comes to mind is in grad school for counseling, one of my courses was an ethics course. And the whole time I'm taking this course, I'm like, well, why isn't there anything like this for ministry, both like lay ministry and ordained ministry? And even just the idea that was, very much ingrained into me as a professional counselor of there's a power imbalance in my relationship with clients. And I'm the one in a position of power. Therefore, I have a responsibility to do no harm. That's my responsibility. And this is like, this is fundamental ethics of the helping professions, across the country. But just that mentality, I don't see. Almost, I would say it's the exception and not the rule, that I see this amongst clergy and leaders in the church of a sense of, I'm the one with power in this situation. I have a responsibility to use that well. And like you said, most of the time, I don't think it's done in a malicious way. I think it's done of coming from feelings of insecurity or inadequacy or whatever. Just the poor use of the authority that they have.
Yeah. And I also just wish that there'd also be more humility. In my experience, when it comes to ecclesial leaders, there's an inverse relationship between the degree of competence and the degree of humility that they exercise, which I think is actually also related to a lot of what you're sharing. Paul, I'm really curious to, hear from you, seeing all of this, recognizing how widespread these issues are, recognizing how challenging it is to address them. And also, frankly, from your experience being unable to address it, right? Like there was no resolution, there was no acknowledgement, there was no healing that was facilitated, or it seemed like even was desired by your diocese. Seeing all of this, how do you show up every day as a Catholic?
Well, you're not the first person to ask that question. And it's one I've asked myself many, many times over the past 3.5 years. Honestly, it depends on the season. Sometimes it's like sometimes there's been times in the last 3.5 years since I left my job at the parish when someone would ask me that question and I would say, well, I went to Mass last Sunday, and at this moment, I'll probably go to Mass this upcoming Sunday. and that's as much as I can say for sure.
Yeah.
That's not how I always felt. That's not how I feel now. And maybe how I feel 3 months from now.
Yeah.
So there's that question is not an easy one to answer, because I very much have a real sense of a relationship with God that has been sustaining and very real for me throughout my life, and throughout all of this and that's happened over the past few years. But then, not just my own experience, but in those years, also hearing, countless stories of people who've experienced far worse than what I experienced,
Mm.
and trying to hold hold space for that. There was a Christian speaker. He wasn't Catholic. Mike Cosper, I believe, who did the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast.
Mm.
He said, he was being interviewed somewhere, and he said, there's a difference between, I forget the exact words he used, but he said there's a difference between not believing in Christ and the story from Scripture and Christianity, and not believing that the church is actually good enough that it does more harm, that it does more good than harm.
Yeah.
And he's like, the people I encounter who are deconstructing or leaving the faith, he's like, are very rarely in that first part. They're in the second group of, yeah, I believe Christ, I believe the gospel, the Christian story. I just don't believe the church does more good than it does harm. That's been my experience very much. I don't know if I could ever not be Catholic. I've been so shaped by Catholicism. I was raised Catholic. I was born Catholic. Like I said, I read encyclicals for fun. Just it's so profoundly shaped my understanding of the human person and my worldview and my sense of justice and dignity.
Yeah.
I don't know if I could ever not be Catholic. For me, it's a question of how much am I able to continue practicing? Because there's an element of, I shared this a year or two ago. I was talking with a friend, and they gave me this image that felt really clear. Speaking of my own experience at my parish, the parish that I worked at, but then I think this very much applies to the church writ large. It's like a bomb went off in my church, and there's a big crater, and everyone shows up to mass, and they just walk around the crater as if it's not there,
Yeah.
And the pastor says mass and preaches, and we just all ignore that the crater's there, and just pretend that there hasn't been this huge, terrible thing that has happened and still is happening. Where me just showing up and participating feels like being complicit in that group pretending. Feels like the story of the emperor with no clothes. I just want to grab the person next to me and like, don't you see the effing crater that's right there in front of all of us?
Yeah.
But we're just going to pretend.
Yeah.
And then,
Well, and then also, I mean, to for that analogy, I think it's also like, there's a crater from a bomb that went off in the church, and there were people that were present that it went off, and they were harmed, and they cannot enter without feeling the harm, and so they either leave or they also sit there with a bunch of people who try to pretend that they were never harmed.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah. And I think there's another layer too of, especially since Spotlight and the abuse crisis really hit mainstream, and especially after the Summer of Shame and the Pennsylvania Grand Jury Report and McCarrick, et cetera, et cetera. It's hard to be a Catholic and not know or not have some sense of the harm that the church can do. I think there's not just a pretending that there isn't a giant flaming crater. I think there's almost like professional wrestling. There's a pretending that we're not pretending. right?
Hmm.
I think that's going on too. So for me, the question isn't like, will I stay Catholic? For me, it's how much do I feel able to participate as if everything is just fine?
Oh, yeah.
So a year and a half ago, in that summer, there was the big like Eucharistic Congress that happened. I don't know, there were 10, 20,000 people at this big conference. And that would be the kind of thing I would go to. Like I went to the Steubenville conferences. Seek was a little bit after my time, but I went to the World Meeting of Families in Philadelphia when the Pope was there. Like the big Catholic gatherings with the big Catholic speakers. That was my thing. And I'm watching it. And I'm like, everyone's celebrating as if there isn't a huge problem. And I was hearing that from survivors in the church as well. And I watched, I saw people post on Facebook. They're posting of this mass. Again, tens of thousands of people at this mass and all these bishops there and all the smells and bells. And it's so big and in some ways really beautiful and compelling.
Yeah.
A few weeks later, I participated as a facilitator for a retreat for survivors of sexual abuse in the church. And mass on that retreat was like 15 people in lawn chairs on a back patio. And that was maybe the best mass I've ever been to.
Yeah.
And as I reflected back on that shortly after, I was thinking to this mass at the Eucharistic Congress, and like, so what made this mass with 15 people so much better? Because no one was pretending that everything was okay, and they were still showing up because God is important to them, and Catholicism is important to them, and the sacraments are important to them, and they're just not pretending. And like that very much did and still does feel like an oasis of, at least there's pockets where people are telling the truth. And those are the pockets of Catholicism I try and spend most of my time in.
Yeah, it's really interesting you brought the Eucharistic Congress, because I remember having very similar feelings at the time. Just this sense of, kind of taking back the culture and the sort of triumphalism that kind of framed a lot of it. And, even for me personally, I just I don't feel like I'm part of that triumphalism, and part of that, we're going to move forward and be the positive force in the world, when so much of my experience, so much of the experience of some people that I know is, it's settings like that where they've often experienced harm or even abuse. And it did not seem evident to me that the Congress had space or would have known what to do with space for people who are experiencing deep pain and trauma because of the church, including the church systemically and institutionally. And so there's, a certain way, an odd, ironically, a sort of shallowness that I think frustrated a lot of Catholics who presented more critical reactions to Eucharistic Congress.
Yeah. At the same time, in a ever-present tension for me to try and hang on to both things as true, all things as true, I know survivors who participated in various ways, in person or virtually, at the Eucharistic Congress, and found it really moving and profound for them. And I believe there's a place for it. I don't believe there was a place for me in it at that particular time. And I don't think there was a place for a lot of people who have been marginalized in the church. Yeah. But I think there is a place for it. Like I feel like I'm oscillating between like all the good things in the church that I've experienced and that I love.
Yeah.
And then like all the really ugly and terrible things,
Hmm.
and hanging on to both of them is very uncomfortable.
Yeah, well, I think that's one of the challenges in the church today, right? There's are so many dynamics in the church that encourage oscillation rather than leaving space for both. So, because as you were sharing, one of my thoughts came to my mind was, oh, well, yeah, that makes sense. That maybe it is good to have a Eucharistic Congress that does speak to certain people and has space for a lot of people, and maybe it's not supposed to be for everyone, right? But that's not how it was framed,
No,
right?
no.
Basically, it's framed that if you're a passionate Catholic, this is something that you will be excited about and that you'll do. And that, if you're critical of it in some ways or don't feel like you belong, I think a lot of people were led to believe through various rhetoric that that meant something was wrong with them. Right.
Yeah.
And actually, I mean, I just did, yeah, I have another interview I've done with a group of women who were involved in a women's ministry. And that one of the challenges for them was that this women's ministry was something that advertised and continues to advertise itself as being for all Catholic women, when in reality, it's not. So then what it does is it takes those women on the margins and actually shames them in the name of ministry.
Yeah. And I think that that's, I've come to believe, as a personal belief, if orthodoxy, small o orthodoxy within Catholicism is a river, the banks of a river, I think the river is much wider than what most people are comfortable with, myself probably included.
Yeah.
And I think I see a constant temptation within the church to carve out my section of the river and be like, this is all there is.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone
Mm-hmm.
outside of this part of the river doesn't belong. If you don't celebrate this thing or hate this group of people, you don't belong in the river at all.
Yeah.
And that's something that I think is just incredible about Catholicism, is like the breadth and the depth of a religion, of an institution, of a community that's 2,000 years old.
Yeah.
With just the extensive teaching and reflection and human stories, looking at the community of the saints that it has, I think the banks of the river are wider than pretty much everyone's comfortable with.
Yeah. Yeah. And I sometimes think about, in this polarized environment where everyone is so pressured to be in their tribes and to mark out what is orthodoxy for your tribe in ways where you can easily identify who's in and who's out, and then you just separate yourself from people who are out. I do think that this is something that the church can help to address, in the fact that the church is so large and is so wide and is a place where you're Catholic by baptism, and therefore you can't just kick out the people that you disagree with or that you think are harmful or that you think are wrong. And we have to deal with the fact that we're all in this communion together. And ideally, hypothetically, we're all supposed to want all of these people to go to heaven. And if we hold that sort of ecclesiology, that sort of communion, I do think that it should also impact the way that we approach these other dynamics in the broader culture. But so often, I think instead we adopt the partisan dynamics of the broader culture and try to make the church much smaller than it actually is, and much smaller than it actually is, even just theologically.
Yeah. So you said partisan. I would the language I have been using is fundamentalist.
Cool.
So the teaching of Pope Francis just profoundly changed my life. I don't know if I would probably not still be Catholic if it wasn't for the teachings of Pope Francis, because of how deeply fundamentalist the Catholicism I was formed in was, and the non-fundamentalist gospel and ecclesiology that he proclaimed. So this is my assessment of his teaching, not his own words. I believe Pope Francis, and Pope Leo has also echoed this just in the few months he's been Pope, of belonging comes first. Belief and behavior come after. Belief and behavior are not prerequisites to belonging. That actually, in belonging to God and to God's people, God's family that is the church, people grow into right belief and right behavior. But belonging comes first. Now, belonging doesn't mean everyone has a right to all the things. There are groups within the church. I believe these people belong in the church, and a lot of their beliefs do, but some of their behaviors are profoundly harmful and need work done. But that vision, that belonging comes first, is different than a fundamentalist vision where that's built off this idea of certainty. We have we know what's true. We possess what's true. And therefore, if someone doesn't agree with us, it's because they're either stupid or malicious. So now there's an in-group, out-group, and we have to constantly be afraid of the out-group, and we have to self-police for anyone in our group that starts to smell too much like the out-group, and make sure that they are exorcised from the group or brought in line in some coercive way. We do that all the time within Catholicism, within different subgroups within the church. But the vision of the church, the universal vision of the church, is the belonging comes first. Yeah. I've come to fundamentally believe that.
Yeah, that feels actually really similar to me. I've been reading the Catechism of Chastity recently, and it reminds me a lot of what the Catechism has to say about chastity, and how it says that chastity presupposes a respect for the rights of persons, and especially the right to information and education in the various like dimensions of the human person, right? And I often think, very similar to what you're saying, we get the order wrong, as if the rights of the person presuppose chastity. I think we especially see this a lot in the employment context in the church. And it does speak to, I think, of something that's much more fundamental than that, even, right? Which is just belonging and belief generally in this dynamic that you were talking about. Paul, I'd be curious to hear from you. You also shared that Pope Francis gave you kind of a different approach to your faith. Different from your upbringing, which to me suggests that there were certain things that you had to let go of in order to cultivate maybe a deeper faith, or a deeper faith that could grapple with these new complexities that you're recognizing in the world. Could you share maybe some of the things that you had to let go of, and what that was like?
Oh man, a lot of things. From things like how many theology books I've gotten rid of, or felt ashamed of, or moved to the bottom shelf because of how their authors have come out and abused kids, or protected abusers, or just sold their soul to partisan politics in disgusting ways. That's one aspect. Personally, I think most fundamentally, I've had to let go of a transactional belief in God. And I think that, and I haven't fully fleshed this out, but I think there's something inherent within fundamentalism, at least as it's present in the church, that there's something inherently transactional about it. That there's a hidden sense of, I have to earn God's favor. I have to earn God's love. I have to earn my place in God's family. And if I can deconstruct from that, I read a book, over the past year, started to dabble a little bit, from the prompting of Francis and Leo into some liberation theology. And Gustavo Gutierrez has a book about the book of Job. And he frames that book as the story of Job's, essentially, he doesn't use this word, but essentially deconstruction from his view of God as fundamentally transactional to a view of God, and the word Gustavo Gutierrez uses is a God of gratuitous love. I think that has been the thing that I've had to let go of the most, and still find, weeds of in my own spiritual life. But if that's true, if I don't have to earn God's favor, if I am not, one mistake away from like tripping into hell or tripping into mortal sin, if God is actually as good as he says that he is, well, now I have a lot of freedom.
Hmm.
Now I can actually be vulnerable with God about my questions and my doubts. Now I don't have to be afraid of like having to show up and perform for him in a particular way. And to me, that's like, the church talks about formation of conscience. In my experience, that's where formation of conscience begins, is in this place where I'm actually able to be vulnerable with the Lord. But in order to be vulnerable, I have to believe that he's actually good and that I don't have to perform. I don't have to earn his love or his favor. So that's the thing most fundamentally that I've had to let go of. And it's been profoundly good that I did.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, for you, I'm also curious, obviously I think I feel a lot of things in your expression of your faith that feel heavy, right? That feel challenging. What sustains you in moving forward in Catholicism?
Oh man, that's a great question. A handful of things. One is I've carved out a little community in the church of people who get it, who don't pretend. And that's a community that's spread across my state and in some cases spread across the country and internationally, of people who I can actually have some type of faith community with, but where I don't have to pretend that things are okay and they don't have to pretend that things are okay. So that's one thing. Prayer very much. I ask a lot of people. I hear from a lot of survivors in the church who choose to stay Catholic. And the ones who choose to stay Catholic, the question often comes up, like, why do you stay? I would say 99% of the time, the response I hear is because of the Eucharist. That's why I stay. That's the sustaining thing. That is not my answer. Honestly, it's the church's vision of the infinite dignity of every human person that I have not found presented in such a compelling way anywhere else. That's something that's sustaining. That's a reason why I stay.
Yeah. Yeah. And I have a follow-up question. I don't think I've ever asked anyone this. And yeah, maybe it gets, answer to the extent that makes sense to you. When you enter prayer, who is God?
So this is like Chris the Jesuit spiritual director.
I know. I can't. I thought I felt myself coming out with the question, and then I was immediately like, "Oh no, is this where I'm gonna do right now?" But here we are. Yeah.
There's a few different images that deeply resonate with me. The one that maybe stands out the most, I listened to a talk, this is several years ago now, maybe 7-8 years ago. I listened to a talk from an Orthodox theologian, Brad Jersak. He's up in Canada. And it was like a talk on YouTube that he gave, preaching a retreat or something. And he told the story of the parable of the lost sheep. And he highlighted a line that I had missed. I think it's in Luke's recounting of it. So in the parable of the lost sheep, you have 100 sheep, and one sheep goes off and wanders astray, and the shepherd leaves the 99 sheep to go after the one. And in Luke's gospel it says, and he searches for the sheep until he finds it. That there is a relentless persistence to God. And that comes with also a tenderness of and a humility, where the shepherd gets down in the ditches and the thorns and isn't pissed off when he finds the sheep.
Cool.
Doesn't scold the sheep. Doesn't give any impression that was put out in any way. But embraces the sheep. Often the image of the good shepherd, like Christ is like carrying the sheep on his shoulders, right? And brings the sheep back, and there is rejoicing. That image tied with, I love Holy Saturday, and in the Liturgy of the Hours, there's an ancient homily from Holy Saturday that's read, and it talks about Christ's descent into hell, but in particular his encounter with Adam.
Yeah.
And it's paired with the vocabulary is meant to invoke this image of the 99 sheep and the lost sheep. And there's this profound tenderness that Christ approaches Adam with, who in the story of Scripture is the one who messed it all up for everybody else. And the reason why Christ just suffered all the brutality that he just suffered, like this is the story. And Christ isn't miffed. He's not disappointed. But there's tenderness there, and there's elevation to lots of language of theosis and divinization in that story. So most fundamentally for me, like my image of God in prayer is a God who is relentless in his pursuit of my own goodness, that is unafraid of all the ways I have mucked things up, that is not put off by those things, and that approaches me with an incredible tenderness.
Yeah. It makes me think of two things. One is this line from Mary Carr where she says, as deep as the hurt is, that's how deep the healing can be, right? And I just think about God, plunging ever deeper into the depths of our own suffering and grief and hurt and insecurity. The other thing that comes to mind is a few years ago, the Minneapolis Institute of Art had an exhibit of art, it was modern art depicting the atrocities of the Nazi Holocaust, and especially as it related to a lot of children. And I just remember going to the exhibit and looking at the art and just really reflecting on what the children had to go through. And I felt so deeply that this is why I believe in God, because I just cannot accept that kids would go through that amount of suffering and that they would die and then that would be over for them. I refuse to accept that there won't be something better for them, where they can find healing. And I think one of the things that sustains me, especially when I'm dealing with kind of toxic people in the church, or people who have caused, different kinds of harm, I often think that, in the end, if I see them in heaven, it won't just be they'll be humbled and apologize and I'll feel better about what they did. I think that the healing will be to such a degree that it won't even matter what they did. And I won't feel that it matters. And maybe it'll matter in some historical sense, to where it was a part of a broader story where beauty and meaning can come out of it. But I won't feel a need to one up them and give me your apology, even if maybe in this life they should do that.
I felt this. It's not even tension. It seems to fit, even if on the surface it seems contradictory. I have grown over the past several years much more in the universalist vein, very much a hopeful universalist position, which I think is actually where the current magisterial teaching is. But also this sense of justice and the church's theology of purgatory. I think it's this profound place of in the light of Christ, I must confront. And in my bones confront all the harm I've ever caused. And not just the immediate harm that I've caused, but the way that that harm has rippled out into the community through generations. And I must know in my bones the full truth and the full scope of that. That's what it means to stand in the light of Christ. There is no shortcut to that. There's no getting out of that. In this life, do I want apologies? Do I want justice? Do I want restoration? Absolutely. And that's what's owed. And that's what I'm deserved. That's what everyone who's been harmed in the church deserves. But like one of my hopes is, if not in this life, I know that in the light of Christ, when all things are brought into the light, the people will have to face all the harm that they've caused.
Yep.
And there's something profoundly hopeful in that for me.
Yeah. You know, I mean, obviously I'm a big proponent of justice and pursuing justice. And that's, you know, I think driven a lot of what I want to do. But I also think that for so many people in the world who've suffered, you know, justice is not something that they will achieve in this life. And one of the things that I worry about overemphasizing justice, the necessity of justice, is that it may encourage people to be tempted to think that their sufferings can't have beauty and meaning with just where they are now, right? And I think especially about this with the case of what's happening with so many immigrants in the United States. You know, what's happening is horrific and horrible, and I actually just can't imagine a world in which you know, this country faces the justice related to what we're doing to so many of these people. But I also don't think that doesn't mean that those lives and those stories can't, you know, find meaning, that those people can't find healing and beauty and you know, I mean, certainly in the next life, hopefully in ways in this life as well. So, you know, there's just like striving for justice while also trying, and I think I try really hard to cultivate spaces and communities where people can find beauty and healing absent the justice that's owed them too.
Yeah. And
yeah,
I mean, the church is celebrating a Jubilee year of hope, and I think there's something about that of without letting go of the reality of that injustice and that harm, and I mean, and being really as willing as much as we're able to confront and to hold on to the horror of that injustice.
Yeah.
Without letting that go or bypassing that, also hanging on to hope in some way, that in the end all will be well. That's not light. That's not heavy. That's not, you know, like, that's not a praise and worship band at a Steubenville youth conference. But it feels real. It feels more real than most things.
Yeah. You know, I guess I'm also kind of curious from you, you know, that note of hope, you know, what are you hopeful for in the church and the work that you're doing?
Depending on the day, I have more or less hope for institutional reform.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like,
well, you know, someone who studied the history of the church broadly, I think this is partly what keeps me going is people are just like, Chris, like, why don't you just like lose your mind at how horrible this is? And I'm like, oh, because I know the history of the church and I've got a job either way, you know?
I think in the work that I do specifically, the thing that gives me the most hope. So in the work I do with education and advocacy about spiritual abuse in the church, at a really fundamental level, the first step is just giving people a vocabulary to understand what spiritual abuse is so that they can name their own experiences as what they actually are, that they can then from there get the support they need, and then from there advocate for themselves. And I think that the good that can come from that, not just individually, but structurally, is pretty much limitless. because if lay people have this understanding of this is coercive and we don't need to tolerate this, and we just stop tolerating this, real change can happen. And I think it can happen relatively quickly, in the sense of not on a universal scale, but on a local scale of in the lay ecclesial group that I'm a part of, or in the Bible study I'm a part of, or the parish council I'm a part of, whatever, of just saying, this is wrong, this is why it's wrong, and we shouldn't tolerate this anymore. So I'm hopeful in that like ground up sense of I think that the church is on the cusp of, at least the church in the United States, coming into a place of new understanding of spiritual abuse, abuse of power, abuse of adults, abuse of conscience, and just like recognizing that these things are not okay. And at some point there's going to be, it's like a turning point where enough people say this is not okay, that things start changing at an institutional level.
Yeah. I mean, I think, absolutely. I think that, that's something I want to work for. And I do think that in a lot of ways there have been big improvements in the church. I mean, certainly we're not in the 1950s anymore, I think, especially when it comes to child sexual abuse. And that I'm really grateful for. And I do see that as a major step forward, even if I think we have so much work to do. But for those people who really drove those changes, I think it really is just like you're saying, it's people who found ways to tell their stories and empowered themselves to not accept the status quo. And I think that, mental health professionals, ministry leaders, people who, share their own stories and promote the stories of others can have a big role to play in that, even if at times the change is very, very slow and not linear.
Yeah. An image that I use both with clients individually as well as in my advocacy work is in Michigan, at least, there's a lot of people who have those like round above ground swimming pools that are like 3 or 4 feet deep. And, like all the kids get together and everyone goes around in a circle and you create a whirlpool in it, right? And this is like a structure of sin, a systemic problem in the church. But it doesn't take more than a few people who did, not that they actively have to work against it, but who just plant their feet and stop going along with it, that the current gets disrupted. And I look at people who tell their stories. I look at like the Sisters of the Little Way and the podcast that they're releasing, and they're telling their story and just planting their feet and letting their story disrupt. Disrupt people on an individual level and start to disrupt systems. Real change can come from just not going along with it anymore. And just letting your story be an obstacle.
Yeah. And I also just think, even at the personal level, part of how these structures continue to exist is because there are a lot of people that have been harmed, but they've all been convinced that they're the only one. So as people start to share their stories, there's, first of all, just this huge relief that people start to recognize that they aren't the only one. But then also when they start to find each other, then they can start thinking about how do we want to address this. And people sharing their stories of harm, it's so vulnerable and it's so challenging. But I mean, I personally have always benefited from people who've made that choice. Yeah. All right, Paul. Well, I think we're coming up. It's an hour, but I mean, I would be really curious to hear from you a couple of things. One is, do you have any like resources or people, organizations that you would recommend people to who maybe want to lean in more into some of these spaces? And then the second one is, what are you up to and how might people plug into the work that you're doing?
Yeah. There are 2 organizations I would very much encourage people to check out. So the first I just mentioned, the Sisters of the Little Way. They are a religious community, and their main focus, their main mission is serving those who have been harmed and marginalized in the church. They have a podcast out now called Descent into Light. I think it's going to be an 8-part series I don't know when this is going to be published, if all the parts will be out by then. But it is just a phenomenal podcast, and they are wonderful people doing really great work. The other organization is Awake. They're a Catholic nonprofit out of Milwaukee that does both ministry and advocacy for survivors of sexual abuse in the church. And I don't know of an organization like them. They hold a space in the church that is that is just fantastic. So I'm starting to tell people I have chosen not to give money to my parish and my diocese as a tithe anymore, because I don't know that it's not going to go to lawsuits trying to get out of paying survivors the money that they're owed, or going to protecting conversion therapy and a whole bunch of terrible things. So I've moved my tithe over to the Sisters of Little Way and Awake. So if people want to follow my example, I would not be sad by that. As far as my work, you can follow my podcast and writing at catholicthirdspace.com. And then if you're interested in doing, I do like individual coaching with people who want to talk through spiritual abuse in the church, and then have workshops and resources, and that's at livingsolidarity.com.
Yeah, and I know a few people who've gone through your workshop, including someone who no longer identifies as Catholic but is a licensed mental health professional, and they told me, oh, this workshop is great and very helpful as a mental health professional, and I think also as personally them. So people have recommended that to me as well. Cool. All right. Well, thank you for taking the time to talk with me, Paul. I think obviously lots more that could be said, and I'm sure the conversation will continue. But for now, thanks for joining me today.
Chris, thanks so much.